Penal Code, crimes committed by public officers. In Chapter 5, Infidelity of Public Officers. Section 1, Infidelity in the Custody of Prisoners. Article 223, Conniving with or consenting to evasion. Any public officer who shall consent to the escape of a prisoner in his custody or charge shall be punished 1. By prison correctional in its medium and maximum periods and temporary special disqualification in its maximum period to perpetual special disqualification if the fugitive shall have been sentenced by final judgment to any penalty. 2. By prison correctional in its minimum period and temporary special disqualification in case the fugitive shall not have been finally convicted but only held as a detention prisoner for any crime or violation of law or municipal ordinance. Article 224. Evasion through negligence. If the evasion of the prisoner shall have taken through the negligence of the officer charged with conveyance or custody of the escaping prisoner, said officer shall suffer the penalties of arresto mayor in its maximum period to prison correctional in its minimum period and temporary special disqualification. Article 225. Escape of prisoner under the custody of a person not a public officer. Any private person to whom the conveyance or custody of a prisoner or person under arrest shall have been confided who shall commit any of the offenses mentioned in the two preceding articles shall suffer the penalty next lower in degree than that prescribed for the public officer. Section 2. Infidelity in custody of documents. Article 226. Removal, concealment, or destruction of documents. Any public officer who shall remove, destroy, or conceal documents or papers officially entrusted to him shall suffer 1. The penalty of prison mayor and a fine not exceeding 200,000 pesos whenever serious damage shall have been caused thereby to a third party or to the person in interest. 2. The penalty of prison correctional in its minimum and medium period and a fine not exceeding 200,000 pesos whenever the damage caused to a third party or to the public interest shall not have been serious. In either case, the additional penalty of temporary special disqualification in its maximum period to perpetual disqualification shall be imposed. Article 227. Officer breaking seal. Any public officer charged with the custody of papers or property sealed by proper authority who shall break the seals and or permit them to be broken shall suffer the penalties of prison correctional in its minimum and medium periods, temporary special disqualification, and a fine not exceeding 400,000 pesos. Article 228. Opening of closed documents. Any public officer not included in the provisions of the next preceding article who, without proper authority, shall open or shall permit to be opened any closed papers, documents, or objects entrusted to his custody shall suffer the penalties of arresto mayor, temporary special disqualification, and a fine not exceeding 400,000 pesos. Section 3. Revelation of secrets. Article 229. Revelation of secrets by an officer. Any public officer who shall reveal any secret known to him by reason of his official capacity or shall wrongfully deliver papers or copies of papers of which he may have charge and which should not be published shall suffer the penalty of prison correctional in its medium and maximum periods, perpetual special disqualification, and a fine not exceeding 400,000 pesos if the revelation of such secrets and the delivery of such papers shall have caused serious damage to the public interest. Otherwise, the penalties of prison correctional in its minimum period, temporary special disqualification, and a fine not exceeding 100,000 pesos shall be imposed. Article 230. Public officer public officer revealing secret of private individual. Any public officer to whom the secrets of any private individual shall become known by reason of his office, who shall reveal such secrets, shall suffer the penalties of arresto mayor and a fine not exceeding 200,000 pesos. Chapter 6. Other offenses or irregularities by public officer. Section 1. Disobedience, refusal of assistance, and maltreatment of prisoners. Article 231. Open disobedience. Any judicial or executive officer who shall openly refuse to execute the judgment, decision, or order of any superior authority made within the scope of the jurisdiction of the latter and issued with all the legal formalities shall suffer the penalties of arresto mayor in its medium period to prison correctional in its minimum period, temporary special disqualification in its maximum period, and a fine not exceeding 200,000 pesos. Article 232. Disobedience to order of superior officer when said order was suspended by inferior officer. Any public officer who, having for any reason suspended the execution of the orders of his superiors, shall disobey such superiors after the latter have disapproved the suspension, shall suffer the penalties of prison correctional in its minimum and medium periods and perpetual special disqualification. Article 233. Refusal of assistance. The penalties of arresto mayor in its medium period to prison correctional in its minimum period, perpetual special disqualification, and a fine not exceeding 200,000 pesos shall be imposed upon a public officer who, upon demand from competent authority, shall fail to lend his cooperation towards the administration of justice and other public service, if such failure shall result in serious damage to the public interest or to a third party otherwise. Arresto mayor in its medium and maximum periods and a fine not exceeding 100,000 pesos shall be imposed. Article 234. Refusal to discharge elective office. The penalty of arresto mayor or a fine not exceeding 200,000 pesos or both shall be imposed upon any person who, having been elected by popular election to public office, shall refuse without legal motive to be sworn in or to discharge the duties of said office. Article 235. Maltreatment of prisoners. The penalty of prison correctional in its medium period to prison mayor in its minimum period, in addition to his liability for the physical injuries or damage caused, shall be imposed upon any public officer or employee who shall overdo himself in the correction or handling of a prisoner or detention prisoner under his charge by the imposition of punishment not authorized by the regulations or by inflicting such punishment in a cruel and humiliating manner. If the purpose of the maltreatment is to extort a confession or to obtain some information from the prisoner, the offender shall be punished by prison mayor in its minimum period, temporary special disqualification, and a fine not exceeding 100,000 pesos, in addition to his liability for the physical injuries or damage caused. Section 2. Anticipation, prolongation, and abandonment of the duties on and powers of public office. Article 26. Article 236. anticipation of duties of a public office. Any person who shall assume the performance of the duties and powers of any public officer or employment without first being sworn to in accord or having given the bond required by law shall be suspended from such office or employment until he shall have complied with the respective formalities and shall be fined from 40,000 pesos to 100,000 pesos. Article 237. Prolonging performance of duties and powers. Any public officer who shall continue to exercise the duties and powers of his office, employment, or commission beyond the period provided by law, regulation, or special provisions applicable to the case shall suffer the penalties of prison correctional in its minimum period and special temporary disqualification in its minimum period and a fine not exceeding 100,000 pesos. Article 238. Abandonment of office or position. Any public officer who, before the acceptance of his resignation, shall abandon his office to the detriment of the public service shall suffer the penalty of arresto mayor. If such office shall have been abandoned in order to evade the discharge of the duties of preventing, prosecuting, or punishing any of the crime falling within Title 1 and Chapter 1 of Title 3 of Book 2 of this Code, the offender shall be punished by prison correctional in its minimum and medium periods and arresto mayor if the purpose of such abandonment is to evade the duty of preventing, prosecuting, or punishing any other crime. Section 3. Usurpation of powers and unlawful appointments. Article 239. Usurpation of legislative powers. The penalties of prison correctional in its minimum period, temporary special disqualification, and a fine not exceeding 200,000 pesos shall be imposed upon any public officer who shall encroach upon the powers of the legislative branch of the government, either by making general rules or regulations beyond the scope of his authority, or by attempting to repeal a law or suspending the execution thereof. Article 240. Usurpation of executive functions. Any judge who shall assume any power pertaining to the executive authorities or shall obstruct the latter in the lawful exercise of their powers shall suffer the penalty of arresto mayor in its medium period to prison correctional in its minimum period. Article 241. Usurpation of judicial functions. The penalty of arresto mayor in its medium period to prison correctional in its minimum period shall be imposed upon any officer of the executive branch of the government who shall assume judicial powers or shall obstruct the execution of any order or decision rendered by any judge within his jurisdiction. Article 242. Disobeying request for disqualification. Any public officer who, before the question of jurisdiction is decided, shall continue any proceeding after having been lawfully required to refrain from so doing, shall be punished by arresto mayor and a fine not exceeding 100,000 pesos. Article 243. Orders or requests by executive officer to any judicial authority. Any executive officer who shall address any order or suggestion to any judicial authority with respect to any case or business coming within the exclusive jurisdiction of the courts of justice shall suffer the penalty of arresto mayor and a fine not exceeding 100,000 pesos. Article 244. Unlawful appointments. Any public officer who shall knowingly nominate or appoint to any public office any person lacking the legal qualifications therefore shall suffer the penalty of arresto mayor and a fine not exceeding 200,000 pesos. Section 4. Abuses against chastity. Article 245. Abuses against chastity. Penalties. The penalties of prison correctional in its medium and maximum periods, and temporary special disqualification shall be imposed. 1. Upon any public officer who shall solicit or make immoral or inherent advances to a woman interested in matters pending before such officer for decision or with respect to which he is required to submit a report to or consult with superior officer. 2. Any warden or other public officer directly charged with the care of the custody of prisoners or persons under arrest who shall solicit or make immoral or indecent advances to a woman under his custody. If the person solicited be the wife, daughter, sister, or relative within the same degree by affinity of any person in the custody of such warden or officer, the penalties shall be prison correctional in its minimum and medium periods and temporary special disqualification.